Chapter 13, we are focused on two different things: observable studies and experiments. In the first half of this chapter, we're going to talk about observational studies. That's going to be the first lesson. And then the second and third lesson are going to revolve around actual experiments. So we're going to start by looking at some of the necessary vocab. So when we're looking at observational studies and experiments, one of the most important things is what's called the response variable. The response variable is the thing that we are actually measuring. So when we did our gummy bear experiment, the thing that we were measuring was how far the gummy bear went. So that would have been considered the response variable. Our condition of interest. This is the factor or the item that you are wanting to focus on. Our focus was, in the gummy bears, does the color affect how far the gummy bear travels? So that would be considered our condition of interest. Does color affect distance? The treatment is what you are actually doing or the process of the experiment. So our treatment was we assigned colors to the gummy bears, red and green, and then we launched the gummy bears and measured their distance. So get some more vocab. Confounding variables. These are unseen variables that interact and affect the factor we are studying. So if you think about our gummy bear experiment, some of the things that we had no control over that affected our gummy bears were the individual weights of the gummy bear. We couldn't control that because it was made by the manufacturer. Or when we had the gummy bears that hit the ground and then bounced and rolled, that was something we couldn't control. Those are examples of confounding variables. Randomization. With randomization, our question is, how can we use randomization to apply our treatments so that confounding variables don't happen? So one of the things that we talked about with the colors, the first time we ran our experiment, we did all red, then all green. And we talked about the green went further because we got better at the process of launching them. So to randomize it, to take out that getting better confounding variable, because that was a confounding variable, the randomization, we decided to alternate colors, red, green, red, green, red, green. That way, it made it more consistent. Control. This was what we talked about when we discussed the experiment. We want to make all of the conditions for our experiment as consistent as possible for each and every trial, so that the only differences are simply the result of the thing that we are studying. So we talked about pushing down the popsicle sticks the same amount, using the same hand, placing them in the same way. We talked about keeping the tape measure consistent, having somebody hold the end of the ruler, the yardstick, so it didn't move around, not picking things up, leaving them in place, alternating the colors. These were all things that we talked about that we were controlling, so that the only thing that was different was the color of the gummy bear. So then we were really able to decide, does color affect how far it goes? So I said today we're talking about an observational study. So let's talk about the specifics of what is an observational study. An observational study is simply a study where the researchers don't interact with the subjects. They simply observe them. Okay, when we did our gummy bear experiment, we interacted with the gummy bears. We used a launcher to launch them. That is an experiment because our hands were involved in the process. If we are doing an observational study, we are simply sitting there and observing what's going on around us. Now there's two types of observational studies. There's a retrospective study and a prospective study. Let's talk about the difference. A retrospective study is an observational study in which the subjects are selected and then we use previous data for our analysis. So if we wanted to study, does blood pressure, high blood pressure affect how long you live? We would look at people who maybe have died recently from high blood pressure and look at, how far back did they have high blood pressure? We're using past data. A prospective study is an observational study in which we choose our subjects and then we follow them into the future. We want to track if a daily vitamin helps children grow. So we're going to pick some kids, we're going to start giving them the daily vitamin, and we're going to track every year how much they've grown. That's an example of a prospective. It's happening in the future, where a retrospective has already happened. We're just using data that's old and already collected. So today's lesson is extremely short. That's all we're talking about, is just looking at an example. These are all observational. So here is our situation. We have a group of randomly selected disabled women aged 65 and older who were tracked for several years. Those who had vitamin B12 deficiency were twice as likely to suffer severe depression as those who did not. This is an observational study. We did not interact with these women. All we did was we tracked for several years whether they had depression or not. This is what we mean by observational. The first question that we're going to answer about this observational study is this retrospective or is this prospective? The answer is it's prospective, because we randomly selected these women and we tracked them for several years. When you track them for several years, you're talking about going into the future. So this is prospective. The next thing you're going to do on an observational study is then identify the subjects that were studied and how were they selected. Well, obviously, the women, the people that we selected were, and notice I am very specific. I didn't say women. I said we studied disabled women age 65 and older. So when you're telling me the subjects, you need to be as specific as possible. And how were they selected? It very clearly says up here, they were randomly selected. So don't just tell me women. I want to know everything I can about those women. They were disabled and they were age 65 and older. So what was the parameter of interest? And again, the parameter of interest is what are we studying? So if we look at this, we want to talk, what were we actually studying about them? We were studying if vitamin B12 somehow affects depression, because we were looking at people who had B12 deficiencies and people who were not B12 deficient. And we were trying to decide if that affects depression. So what was the conclusion that we drew? That it's clearly stated in our word problem. Our conclusion is right here. It said, those who had a vitamin B12 deficiency were twice as likely to suffer severe depression as those who did not. That sentence right there, word for word, is your conclusion. Those who had vitamin B12 deficiency were twice as likely to suffer severe depression. So these are the problems that we're going to be doing in class. When you come to class, you're going to do 5 problems just like this, going through the exact same types of questions. So I will see you in class.